Hello class and welcome to week 2 of ENC 1102. This week we're going to be discussing three sort of foundational theories of literary theory: formalism, structuralism, and deconstruction. And just maybe to get this off right off the bat, will have noticed in our readings this week that we can really have kind of two words that are almost kind of synonyms for structuralism and deconstruction. So formalism in deconstruction. One word you see tossed around formalism a lot is new criticism, and one word you see tossed around a lot with deconstruction is post-structuralism. So we'll kind of like briefly mention those a little bit, but I really wanted to focus on what you see outlined here on our title slide. And maybe another little disclaimer here. This is probably going to be the most difficult week theory-wise of the course. I think once you especially get a grasp on deconstruction, a lot of the other theories kind of start falling into place. So it'll be the hardest to maybe wrap your mind around these concepts, but I promise that if you stick with it, and hopefully by the end of this lecture, what you've done for the readings this week, what you are doing for the readings this week, it'll make a little bit more sense. So these are just the objectives we're looking at. I'm not really going to go word by word with these objectives because you can see them here on the screen. But we are working toward these this week, and you might notice here something that's different from last week, that one of the objectives we're working on is close reading. So our poetry assignment for this week, or poetry response, is actually a close reading response to a passage of your choice. I'm sorry, not a passage of your choice, to the poem that we're reading for this week, which we'll also be discussing a little bit in this lecture. So just to maybe keep an eye out for that, our midterm paper is actually going to be a close reading paper. So it's a good idea to maybe be thinking about that now, and we are going to get some practice with that. So here's what we're going to be reviewing this week. For this week's lecture. Formalism, Structuralism, Deconstruction. You can see our little readings there. You can see we have more readings in The Secret Garden for this week, and we also have the poem, The Immigrant Song by Tishani Doshi this week. So yeah, it's a lot of reading, but again, as maybe we've been emphasizing now for the past week, 2 weeks, before our class started last Monday, our class is a 16-week course condensed into 7 weeks. So we have less than half the amount of time we normally have to complete everything that we need to for this class. So that is why we are on such an advanced reading schedule. Promise I'm trying to make it as manageable as possible, but we do have to meet certain expectations for the college and for the state of Florida that we just can't meet if we don't have this kind of maximum overdrive reading every week. So just to keep that in mind, and to please make sure that you are trying to space things out over the week so that not everything is building up for you on just Saturday and Sunday. Doing a little bit of reading every day is a lot better than having to do it all on one day. So for some due dates, just like last week, we have a quiz, discussion, and a poetry response assignment, all of which are due this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And as I've been emphasizing from the beginning of our course, please, if you feel that you need an extra day or two to work on one of these assignments, if maybe things just you're not feeling very well, you're ill, things just aren't clicking for you right now, please don't hesitate to reach out. We can try to work out an extension date if that would help you do your best work on an assignment. And again, you can't maybe have too liberal an extension or too many of them, but here and there, if you need one, like this week, it's perfectly fine to ask for one. So let's get right into the real content of today's lecture. And we won't be spending too much time going over this week's poet, Tishani Doshi, but just a little bit of information for you. Now, she is an award-winning Indian poet. Now, you will have noticed from having read or started The Secret Garden last week that Mary came to England after having spent her whole life in India. So I thought this week it'd be very important for us to get the perspective, see the perspective of an Indian poet about what it's like maybe to be an immigrant from perhaps an Indian person's perspective. Because we must again remember that The Secret Garden, Frances Hodgson Burnett wrote that 111 years ago. And she was white, so she has a vastly different perspective, it goes without saying, from someone who was born in India now. So that is why we're reading Tishani Doshi. And she's an award-winning poem, not maybe just assigning you a poem just to make you read a poem. Her work is very much worth reading. She's won a lot of different awards, and I've only listed 2 here. And she's also multi-talented, so for those of you who are dancers out there, she's a dancer too. She explores themes like grief, isolation, more. We're really just focusing on one poem this week, as we are every week, but I highly encourage you to check out more of her poetry, to read more poetry from the other poets that we're reading this semester. So let's take a quick look at the Immigrant's Song here. So just for some things that you might want to keep in mind while you read this poem, maybe a few times to really get a grasp on it. So this poem is really recalling the past to silence it. You may notice that, especially in the first half of the poem, the speaker kind of has a refrain of let us not, let us not, let us not. It's a silencing effect. We don't want to relive the past because we want to focus on the now, the present. We're not going back to where the country from which we came. We're thinking about the country to which we came, not from which. And so there's a generational divide in this poem as well. That there are certain hardships, certain sufferings, certain experiences that the immigrant generation will have that perhaps their grandchildren 2 generations down the road will not have. It's a very big cultural divide for them. And so here are just some questions maybe to think about as you read this poem. According to the speaker, what does it mean to be an immigrant? What happens when we share our experiences? And maybe why would someone not want to share theirs? And finally, how do our relationships with other people and with society determine our identities? Just some things for you to be thinking about as you read this poem. Now, let's get into the real meat of today's lecture, this week's literary theories, beginning with formalism and new criticism. So, I think this might be the only slide we really have for formalism and new criticism right now. So right off the bat, you might notice that from our readings that formalism, new criticism is kind of a difference between East and the West, specifically Russian and Western. So you can see some of our theorists there, and perhaps one name some of you might recognize is T.S. Eliot. It is him indirectly who you have to thank for giving us Cats, the musical, and the movie. And I'm not going to provide any context for that. So formalism. It's probably important to note no one does formalism anymore, and spoiler alert, you're going to hear me say that a few more times over the next couple of slides. No one does formalism anymore. A formalist analysis of the text examines its formal workings. It's literally its structure. And that's a word we're going to see again soon too, trust me. So we're looking at form over content. So say if you're looking at a poem, is it in stanzaic form? Is it in free verse? Is it a limerick? Stuff like that. So some of the things you might have learned when you were forced to do Poetry Week or Poetry Month back in elementary and junior high school. Now, new criticism, it's not necessarily springing from formalism, but it is one of the foundational pieces of literary theory. And this might be most recognizable nowadays, new criticism, as the originator, the progenitor of the close reading. Now, close reading is something that I'm sure almost all of you have heard of, whether you're at the high school level, otherwise known as the secondary level, or the post-secondary level, college. A lot of curricula will have you completing close readings of literature. In fact, this is probably the reason why you don't like literature, if you don't like literature, because a close reading is taking a very in-depth look at just the text itself. And it's not to say that it really kind of doesn't examine historical context at all. We're not looking at that. New criticism focuses almost exclusively on the text in question. So if you're reading the novel, like say if you did an AP literature or language exam in high school, you're going to be doing a close reading, kind of. You're just looking at what's been given to you and you're just working with that. And now you may notice in our readings, you may remember from our readings as well that formalism, new criticism, almost 100 years old. I think new criticism came around in the 1930s, popular in the 1940s as well. That's how old that system of literary theory is. It's 80 years old, almost 90 years. Yikes. So if you ever think about why you don't like literature and literary analysis, you might want to think about where a lot of that literary analysis you've been doing, where that came from. Came back in a time before civil rights. Yeah. So, let's get into structuralism. Oh, and from the previous slide, it's not to say that close reading does not have its advantages. In fact, many scholars nowadays, including myself, it's occasionally a pretty good idea to maybe get a little bit granular. What is literary analysis without analysis? So, my point was not necessarily to denigrate school institutions, statewide curricula, college curricula. It was only to make the point that formalism, new criticism are pretty old, and maybe nowadays new criticism doesn't entirely account for the new developments in literary theory that we have had since its heyday 80, 90 years ago. So, structuralism. This is another structuralism and the next theory, deconstruction. They can be pretty difficult to wrap your mind around, but I promise I'm going to try to make this as manageable as I can. So you may notice on the slide here, the red pill and the blue pill. What are you going to have, Neo? What does the red and the blue pill, what does that kind of signify to you? Maybe it might not be obvious, and it'll be kind of obvious when I say the answer. It's binary. It's a sense of binariness. You can get either red or either blue. That's the key, I think, to structuralism and semiotics. Things either are something or they are not something. So it may be pretty confusing when you do the readings and you're looking up, seeing all these like different terms for things you might never have heard of. Signs, signifiers, signified. What in the world are those? Well, let's think about this. Maybe before we get into signs, signifier, signified, let me just ask you a question. I seriously want you to take a few seconds to think about this. Maybe pause the video just so you can kind of gather your thoughts before we kind of answer this question here. That is, how do we know a cat is a cat? Now, I'm going to pause for a few seconds while maybe you think about that. And there'll be enough time to maybe pause the video and then play it again when you're ready to hear my thoughts on this. So, how do we know a cat is a cat? My facetious answer to that, it's not a dog. What is a cat? Well, it's not a dog. Oh, okay. How do we know it's raining outside? Because it's not raining? No, stuff like that. So here's what I mean. Maybe structuralism is really kind of taking a look at language. So we have 26 letters in our alphabet. Why does A, the letter A, have the meaning of A? Why do we know that A is A and that B is B? because it's not any of the other 25 letters. A is not B, A is not C, and so on to Z until we must conclude that A is A. It's a sense of binariness. So let's try to maybe think about the sign, the signifier, and the signified. Maybe this might make that binariness, if it's maybe a little bit confusing right now, might make a little bit more sense after this. So structuralism, semiotics, they kind of conceive of, say, literature and even of the world in terms of signs. And a sign, if we think about it in terms of a math equation, and I kind of reverse the way that equations normally, well, maybe not necessarily. If we think about it in terms of x is equal to y plus z there, or however you want to do it, y is equal to x plus z. Sign is equal to the signifier plus the signified. And there are a few ways that we can kind of maybe understand signifiers and signified. So let's begin with the signifier. The signifier, is you might be able to see on the screen there, as hopefully you can see. It's an arbitrary symbol that is unrelated to the concept that it represents. So imagine that being, say, the literal word cat. C-A-T. That is a signifier. Now, why is the word cat a signifier? It's because there's no like hard and fast rule that says the word cat has to represent the idea of a cat. Like when you literally see your cat Pookie there, or in my case is something you may have seen last week, my cat Hammy. Who's to say what is saying that he is a cat? That's just something that we as a society have collectively agreed upon. Society being people from the dawn of time in terms of their relationships with cats. It's arbitrary. Nothing's saying that my cat Hammy has to be called a cat. For all we know, in an alternate universe, he could be a dog. He'd still look like a cat and everything we associate with a cat, but we would call him dog instead. And the same thing with a dog. Your dog could look exactly the way she does now, and yet we could call them cat in another life because it's arbitrary. Nothing's saying cat has to literally be called a cat. Could be a horse, could be a dog, could be bacon, could be tricycle. Nothing's saying that it has to be a cat. That's why it's arbitrary. So a signifier is just an arbitrary symbol that's unrelated to the concept that it represents. But the signified is the concept of the symbol. What is meant by the symbol? What ideas are evoked by the symbol? So, when I say the word cat, what do you think of? You're probably thinking of your house cat. What about your house cat? Well, you can see his appearance. So I can see my cat in my mind right now. Black, white, he's sleeping on the floor next to me. Okay, what else do you think of? You think of whiskers. You think of a furry face. You think of a tail. You think of jumping. You think of stealing food. You think of a dog chasing him. Those are all the ideas that are meant by cat. What comes to mind when the word cat is evoked. That's the signified. Or maybe take something like an example of the human body. Nothing gross. Just say the word armpit. Okay, so the literal word armpit is the signifier. But the signified, what is meant by the armpit, it's the armpit itself. Not the word armpit, but the literal armpit. And what comes to mind when you think of armpit? You might think hairy, you might think stinky, you might think fleshy. That is the signified. The signified is the concept of the symbol. What is meant when you invoke the symbol, when you evoke the symbol, excuse me. The signifier is the arbitrary symbol. So it's unrelated to the concept. It's just used to represent the concept, a word, an image. So how do we know, So how do we apply this to literature? Well, a structuralist will examine the underlying principles that govern the composition of a work of literature. So we're essentially breaking things down into their most basic parts. Think about, say, within a sports season. Right now, as of October 24th, 2022, the Phillies and the Astros are playing in the World Series. But really, by all metrics, the Phillies are what we call a Cinderella team. And what do we mean by a Cinderella team? Well, commonly, the common theme among a Cinderella team is that that team was never really meant to make it to the World Championship in the first place. They had a lot of things going against them that they overcame. So despite all the adversity, they still made it to this point. That's a Cinderella team in sports. But say we have a Cinderella story in literature. Well, that might be, what do you think of when you think of Cinderella? What are all the key factors of that story? Well, it's essentially a rags to riches story. It's very kind of maybe even a little bit euphemistic there, but a rags to riches story, a zero to hero story. They have a lot of common components that fall in line with what we call this idea of structuralism. Take, for instance, Star Wars. Everyone knows Star Wars. The story of Luke Skywalker, we'll say in the very first Star Wars movie, I think in 1976, George Lucas has, I say admitted, and that makes it sound kind of dirty, he professes that one of his main influences for Star Wars was Joseph Campbell's hero myth. It's like an 11-part structure of the typical hero story, the kind of zero to hero story, the farm boy who ends up saving the world. That's structuralist. That is structuralism in effect right there, a real world thing that everyone knows. Star Wars can be broken down structurally as terms of literary theory, just like that. Now, let's take a look at the three kind of the main signs that I believe Ferdinand de Saussure outlined, and unfortunately I'm forgetting the other theorist's name right now. We have three kind of main semiotic signs here: the icon, the index, and the symbol. And I went looking for some images that could kind of represent this, and I think I found three that are pretty helpful here. So the icon, an icon sign, is a literal representation of the signified. So if you just maybe put your hand over that pair of shoes and the symbols down there, and so that you can only see the icon, you can see very clearly, and there's an obvious problem gender-wise with everything we're seeing on this slide here. But if you remember, structuralism is supposed to be binary, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later when we get to deconstruction. But so bear with me in terms of male and female here. Icon. You see the icon on the left. That's a man. You see that, you say that is a man, a traditional man. You see the icon on the right, you say that's a traditional female. Okay, it's very obvious what those are supposed to be. They are a little representation of a man and a woman. Now, an index sign. It has a direct link to and is a reliable indicator of the signified, but it is not actually the signified. So we know from the icons that is actually a man, actually a woman. Now look at the index here. We've reduced it to a boot and a high heel. Those have direct links to the genders that we're referring to. So if you see that boot, you think that is a man's shoe. This is a representation of a man. You see that high heel, you think that's a woman's shoe. It's a representation of a woman. So say, take this with the bathrooms. Like, again, putting all implications aside, all culturally, bear with me here. Normally on the bathroom signs, you would see that male and that female symbol, like the literal man-shaped body, female-shaped body, to indicate this is the bathroom where men go and this is the bathroom where women go. Now imagine if you replaced those icons, that man and that woman on the sign, with the man's shoe and the woman's shoe. Would you still be able to figure out which bathroom you're supposed to go to? You probably would, yeah. Now, symbol. The symbol is the signifier's, really refers to how the signifier's relation to the signified is arbitrary. So symbols don't have any meaning unless they are culturally kind of agreed upon and prescribed. So look at that symbol. Most of you probably seen this. Maybe you played a Pokemon game or something. You'd recognize these symbols from there. The symbol on the left there, the one with the circle and the arrow pointing up, that's the commonly agreed upon symbol for a man, male. And the symbol on the right, the one with the circle and the little cross pointing down, that's the commonly agreed upon symbol for a woman, female. So the key words there are commonly agreed upon. We all know from looking at the icon that is a man and that is a woman. We all know from looking at the index, or at least we can extrapolate from looking at the index, that we're referring to a man and we are referring to a woman. But in terms of the symbol, how would we know by looking at those symbols that we're referring to a man and a woman? Putting aside all context right now, we wouldn't. There's no way we could possibly know that's a man and that's a woman unless society told us implicitly that's what it was referring to. And if that maybe doesn't make sense, please feel free to email me, or maybe if you'd rather leave a comment on the YouTube video, I'll see that too, and I would be happy to explain that more in depth if that doesn't necessarily make as much sense right now. But again, icon, it's a literal representation of what it's of the signified. The index has a direct link to the signified, but it's not a literal representation of it. And the symbol, that relation is arbitrary entirely. The symbols is only there to be, again, an arbitrary representation of what it's meant to represent. Now, deconstruction. Here we go. You will remember from the structuralism slides, we're talking about this idea of binariness, and there are a few examples that could better demonstrate the binariness of structuralism semiotics than men's and women's bathrooms, men and women in general. So, where do we go from there? We are just like with formalism, and we're not really doing structuralism anymore. You will be hard-pressed to find any structuralist in literary theory anywhere. So how do we get to whatever point we're at right now? Well, we moved beyond the binary. You see, deconstruction as a literary theory is breaking things down to the point that they're breaking free. There's no such thing as stability anymore. So there are many forces at play in the text, and yes, I am reading off this point, that undermine stability and allow for many potential meanings. That's what deconstruction refers to. So this might be why, no, I'm sorry, I take that back. Many potential meanings. This is the kind of key here. So imagine structuralism is kind of just a tree trunk. And that's kind of really it. There aren't really any branches there. But deconstruction is what we might call dendritic. D-E-N-D-R-I-T-I-C. Dendritic. And that means, it just means it has a lot of branches. That's what deconstruction refers to. So we have a lot of different meanings in text. Structuralism breaks things down to their most basic components, but those can only ever mean what they mean. Otherwise, they can't mean anything else. We know A is A because it's not B. It's binary. But deconstruction is destabilizing meaning so that we have room to have many different interpretations of the text. And please note, what you see here on the slide, what I just said, the operative word is many, not any, many. You can't just have any interpretation of a text. You can't claim that The Secret Garden is a novel about aliens because there's no evidence for that. Deconstruction, just because there's room on the field to play ball, doesn't mean that you can chuck things out to the stands. Somebody still has to be able to catch it. We need to have evidence to support our perspectives. And As maybe some of our comments on last week's assignment start rolling out, you might see me maybe mentioning that in the comment box, is that evidence is very important. Evidence is one half of the battle when it comes to literary analysis. It's, well, maybe 1/3. You make your point, you use evidence to support your point, and then you analyze that evidence in relation to your argument. Deconstruction has many meanings. And please note, it's deconstruction, not destruction. Destruction is to tear things down, to break them apart. Deconstruction is not about breaking apart a text, not about tearing it down. It's not about destroying a text. It's about deconstructing it. So we're not taking things apart. We're looking for multiple meanings. Well, a text will have multiple meanings, and it's not like you necessarily have to look for multiple meanings. But maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. Actually, no, on the next slide, it's not going to be about that. So again, to repeat something that I said for structuralism and for formalism, nobody really does deconstruction anymore. You'd be hard-pressed to find what they call a high, H-I-G-H, deconstructionist in academia nowadays, because really the ideas of deconstruction have been subsumed by other literary movements, the literary movements that came after the deconstructionist movement. So no one's really a high deconstructionist anymore. If anyone's engaging with this, they're engaging with the scholars that kind of pioneered these ideas in the first place. Jacques Derrida, Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault. That's more who people might be looking at nowadays. And now another reason why is because it may not seem, you may be tempted to think that these ideas aren't very revolutionary, but we must keep in mind that when deconstruction was first becoming popular, it had never been seen before. For decades to that point, in the 1950s, when it really started coming into vogue, we were doing structuralism, structuralist analysis, where everything was either this or this. Now at this point, we have so many different interpretations that we could make about a text because of things, like new context and whatnot. And this might also be why close readings can be a little bit problematic at the secondary and post-secondary level, because you're missing out on a lot of different factors from outside research. You're missing out on a lot of different context, a lot of different information that you could get from some outside research into a text. So there's only so much you can do with the close reading, and to an extent, the close reading might even fall into the trap of structuralism. So we really are at this point where deconstruction is just being taken as such a given that we don't even necessarily think about it as much anymore. And so before maybe moving on to the next slide, I do want to point out that perhaps is this no more apparent than with queer theory. Next week, week 3 of our course, we're going to be talking about kind of what I've bundled together as gender studies. So feminist theory, queer theory, and then as an offshoot of queer theory, we have disability studies. Now, you may kind of have noticed before that, or even just think it might be obvious, that feminist theory is in response to a sense of like male domination in literature, in literary theory, in the academy. The feminist theory builds off of that. Like, to this point, we've only looked at this one perspective. Now let's look at this other one perspective, male and female. But what is that not accounting for? What is one of the biggest cultural debates that we have going on in the world right now? It's the queer. To queer something, queer in its essence, is deconstruction. It's deconstructing the very idea of gender. Male, female, and all the genders in between that. The sexuality spectrum. And I'm not advocating for anything here. Please note that. So I'm not saying this or that about anything. I'm only saying that in terms of literary theory. That's what queer studies aim is at its very core. It's a deconstruction of gender. And disability studies, in turn, as we'll learn next week, is kind of like a deconstruction of queer. That even though we queer gender, the queer itself as an interpretation of gender cannot, or it did not initially account for disability. So can you kind of see what I'm getting at here? Deconstruction, it's not tearing down, it's expanding all these different meanings and all these different interpretations. So one thing you may have noticed doing our readings, I believe on the one that asked you to read 7 pages, was the scholar Roland Barthes and this idea of death of the author. Now, our readings did not go very much into detail about this concept of death of the author, so I wanted to talk about it a little now. Basically, what death of the author refers to is, how shall I say, the author's word is not the only, it's not the definitive interpretation of a text. So what does that mean? Well, remember to the idea of, going back to the ideas of structuralism, and we're still in deconstruction right now, so these ideas are important too. The death of the author deconstructs meaning. Before, with new criticism, and this is another thing why new criticism might not be the strongest approach toward literature, literary analysis, literary theory, close reading really only looks at the text, if you'll remember. And so if you're only looking at the text, you're not looking at any outside perspectives at all. No research about the author's life, the time period in which they were living, no reading into the scholarship of other people who have spoken about the poem. If you're literally only just looking at the text, that means you're just taking the author at face value. Whatever's in the text, that's all that matters. But that's kind of problematic, isn't it? Why, by that metric, we can't talk to any of our friends and family about how we thought about the latest, I don't know, Fast and Furious movie, Star Wars movie. We literally just have to look at what's been given to us. But that's kind of problematic. That's why Roland Barthes called for the death of the author. The author can't be the one authority on this text. Think about how much you didn't know when you were a teenager, how much you don't know now. And realize that no matter how gifted, no matter how talented an author is, no matter how much they do know, there's still a whole lot more that they don't know. And that would include having a sufficient level of self-awareness all the time. Think about The Secret Garden. 111 years ago, Burnett wrote that. I seriously doubt she may be considered just how racist some of the things she was saying in that book is. And that's why we're talking about this idea of death of the author. Because if we were just to listen to Burnett herself, all we'd think about is positive thinking is great, and there is healing power in the gardens. But isn't there more to the book than that? Can't we glean a lot more from the book than just what Burnett might have told us? Of course we can. That's why Barthes pushed forth the idea of death of the author. The author, capital A, cannot really exist if we were to have this idea of like a new post-structuralist, this more deconstructionist world. Things have many meanings, and if the author is the only one who can tell you those meanings, that means that the reader's experiences no longer matter. But they do. The reader's experiences do matter. In fact, they matter so much, there's another form of literary theory, another movement in literary theory that we're not covering this semester, but that is essentially kind of like related to this. It's reader response criticism. Your interpretation as a reader matters. What you think about the text matters. The reader becomes centric to the text with death of the author, not the author. So class, that's all I have for this week's lecture. And I know that was a lot of stuff to cover, but I hope I could maybe break it down into information that's a little bit more manageable than what you might have encountered in our readings this week. But please, if you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to reach out to me through email, through in your discussion post this week, or maybe if you'd like to, or if maybe you're not in our class and you stumbled upon our video, commenting on it and just asking, can I get some clarification on this? And I'd be happy to provide that for you. So with all that said, class, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.